the contents of the local library there in Manchester, New York. They didn't have very much there, and the Smith family was too poor to join the library, which charged a fee. The odds that he ever even went into the place are relatively low. His mother says that he didn't read very much. Anyway, there was nothing available of this kind that would make it possible for him to compose an account. And yet, in detail, he's given us a very realistic portrait, right down to the small items like the groaning of the earth, the aftershocks, and so on, that matches what we know from modern seismology. More recently, Bart Kowalis of the BYU Geology Department has analyzed accounts of massive volcanic eruptions from historic times and finds that, again, the details of the events described in 3rd Nephi fit what seems to be a massive volcanic eruption, multiple volcanic eruptions possibly. And interestingly, of course, we know that the area that John Sorensen identifies as Book of Mormon lands is an area very prone to volcanic eruptions and earthquakes. In fact, just a couple of years ago, I remember flying into Guatemala City late at night, and as we were coming in to make the approach to the airport, we looked out the windows to the left side of the plane. There seemed to be a forest fire going on below us. In fact, it was an erupting volcano. The volcanoes are still very active there in Guatemala, and we seem in the Book of Mormon to have a realistic account written by someone who was an eyewitness to such events, something that was beyond the reach of Joseph Smith at any point in his life. Another area where Joseph Smith gets things right that he should not have known from his own environment in upstate New York is in the matter of olive culture. And many will remember the great olive allegory of Jacob 5, where we're given a detailed description of olive culture, and it's used as a symbol for the history of Israel, past and future. Now, obviously, the point of that chapter is not to give us details about horticulture, but in fact, along the way, it does. A few years ago, the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, FARMS, convened a conference at BYU on Jacob 5, and among the people who presented papers there were horticulturists and botanists and so on. And we concluded that, in fact, the portrait given in Jacob 5 of olive culture is very, very accurate. Yet olive trees don't grow in upstate New York. So how did Joseph Smith know about all the details of pruning and digging and dunging and all of the things that have to be done in this labor-intensive work of cultivating olive trees? It's very unlikely that he could have read anything about that because nothing was written about it. Most of the great olive manuals, and there were manuals of olive culture, come out of the ancient Middle East or the classical world. In fact, what's really striking about this is that olive culture seems to have begun in the very area from which Lehi came. And so it's interesting that the Book of Mormon carries with it this long allegory about olive trees. A colleague of mine and I actually did an examination of the economic history of olive cultivation in the ancient Near East. Not a topic that necessarily sends the blood flowing at high speed or gets you excited, but we actually had a lot of fun with it. We tried to stick some puns in it to keep it entertaining. The article is entitled Graft and Corruption. And we found that olive culture played a really important role in ancient economics around the Mediterranean basin. But we looked at a lot of these ancient manuals, most of them not translated, and we found that in some cases, down to the details, almost down to the phrasing, the same sorts of things were discussed in those manuals as show up in Jacob 5. And Jacob 5 is accurate in every detail except possibly for one. It is said in Jacob 5 that when you take branches of a wild olive tree and graft them into the tame olive tree, those wild branches will bring forth tame fruit. This is not actually true, but it's used as a metaphor in Jacob 5 for the miracle of conversion. For when you take a Gentile and graft that Gentile into the house of Israel, that Gentile becomes an Israelite. Now, this is a miracle, and so not to be expected in the natural course of events. And we did find one reference in an ancient Greek manual of olive culture that said, well, okay, it's true that wild branches will not give off tame fruit when they're grafted into a tame tree. But sometimes it can happen miraculously, and that's a divine sign. And so it seemed to me even there that Jacob 5 is accurately representing the miracle of conversion, what we might call that miraculous process by which a person becomes a member of the church and the family of God. There are other small details. When Zemnariah is executed, and that occurs in 3 Nephi 4:28, he's hung from a tree, and then the tree is ritually chopped down as well. In an age where we're concerned about the world's rainforests and so on, that seems a real waste of a tree. But it makes sense if you understand that Jewish law required the felling of a tree that was used for execution, a hanging tree. There were probably reasons for this. People didn't want it to become a monument to the person who'd been executed. Also, it was regarded as somehow ritually unclean and had to be taken down. But how did Joseph Smith know this in upstate New York? A boy who had received only a few months of formal education, certainly no rabbinic training, and yet these are rules that come out of ancient rabbinic law. Another fascinating feature of the Book of Mormon that many probably are already familiar with, but some are not, is the idea of chiasmus. Chiasmus is a literary structure that's characteristic of ancient Semitic literatures, particularly Hebrew literature. What it is a list. It's a technique of listing items off in one direction, then repeating that list again in reverse order. So A, B, C, C, B, A. Sometimes an item is particularly intended to be emphasized, and then you say A, B, C, D, C, B, A, so that people will notice that item D in the middle. Now, we don't notice this very much, but an ancient audience who was trained in chiastic ways of thinking would recognize and would be looking for that kind of structure. It was especially useful for memorizing things. Do we have examples of chiasmus in the Book of Mormon? We do. And the story of how they were found is really fascinating. The founder of Farms, John Welch, who is now a professor of law at BYU, was a missionary in Germany. And at one time he heard a lecture on the subject of chiasmus and how it was a characteristic of ancient Semitic literature. Hearing that, he thought, well, if that's typical of Semitic literatures, that is, literatures from the Semites of the ancient Near East, then chiasmus ought to show up in the Book of Mormon as well, which is a product of a culture that came out of the Semitic Near East. So he went home to his apartment that night and immediately began to find chiasms in the Book of Mormon. And some of the finest chiasms known to us from ancient literature occur in the Book of Mormon. Let me just give you an example that I've made up to show you what chiasmus is, and then I'll give you a couple of examples from the Book of Mormon itself. Here's one that follows the pattern A, B, C, D, D, C, B, A. I left my house, got into the car, went to the store, and picked up some milk. Having bought the milk, now I'm coming out, I left the store, got into the car, and returned to my house. Okay? Now, here's another one. Maybe someone's accused me of having stolen the milk. So I put something in the middle. Item E. A, B, C, D, E, D, C, B, A. I'll use the same basic story, sad though it is. I left my house, got into the car, went to the store, and picked up some milk. Then I paid for it at the counter. Having bought the milk, I left the store, got into my car, and returned to my house. All right, now a person trained to look for chiasms would know that the point of that little story is that I paid for it at the counter. Well, let's look at a couple of examples from the Book of Mormon, examples that I think are extraordinarily impressive.